But as you said, Bill, he called on them saying it is up to you to drive them out of your communities, out of your holy places. And he put the onus on them to be the driving force in that region where these things are fomenting and starting and spreading like a cancer throughout Europe. And we're about to see him arrive there now on the steps of Air Force One.
As we await, Marc Thiessen's with us now. And Marc, good morning to you. What do you believe the message to NATO leaders is today?
We have to take this terrorist threat seriously. It's the same message he delivered to Muslim leaders in Saudi Arabia and Israel. This threat is real. We just saw it rear its ugly head once again in Manchester, England. It's happened in Brussels, as you pointed out. It's happened in Paris. And we need to address this. This is the challenge that we have to address as an alliance.
Israel's defense minister made a comment during an interview in the past 24 hours. And what he talked about is the continent of Europe and its politically correct character. Those are the words he chose. And he talked about, well, there's a lot of talk from the leaders, but little action. Do you believe there has been any action coming out of the Bataclan or coming out of Brussels airport or perhaps even Manchester from 36 hours ago?
Well, I think it varies from country to country. I think clearly, as when we witnessed in Paris and Brussels, those intelligence services were clearly unprepared. They have a huge problem with influx of refugees that ISIS has said they are using the refugee flows to infiltrate Europe and bring terrorists into Europe. And so that's a huge problem for them. They also have a problem in Europe that we don't have in the United States. It's much harder for them to get to the United States than it is to get into Europe. But they also have another problem, which is that we here in the United States, for most of our history, have had a tradition of the melting pot. Where people come here and they become very quickly in a single generation become Americans. When you move to France, you don't necessarily become French in a generation. When you move to Belgium, you don't necessarily become Belgian in a generation. And so there's an alienation from the larger society that we don't experience here in the United States in the same way that they have to
I think it's exactly what he was saying. The problem of extremism among Muslim youths are not integrated into society. And we have seen that in France. We've seen it in Belgium, as you point out. We see it in England as well, Marc. Today. And until he says, until you adopt universal European values, this will not change.
But you can't force people to do that. It's part of the culture. So if you go to Minneapolis, where there's a huge Muslim population, in one generation those kids are listening to rap music and riding skateboards and being very American. That's the natural inclination, unless they are raised by people who try to withhold them from having those values because they feel like they're Americans. When you come here, you become an American very quickly. My mother came from Poland. My father was first generation from Germany. I'm as American as apple pie. In a single generation. You don't have that happening in Europe in the same way. They are seen as other in Europe. They are not seen as French. They are not seen as Belgian. They're not seen as British. And that's a big problem for their society, is that they don't have the tradition of the melting pot that we do. And that causes a great deal of alienation. And also, they don't have the security structures that we do as well.
Marc, there's been a lot of reporting overseas, some of this coming from the Telegraph, talking about the fact that where this young man was living, that there was a neighborhood where there were many other people who were Libyan, potentially directly from Libya, who had settled. They had been trying to escape Gaddafi at some point, but they did share some strains of what it appears he may have gotten involved with as well, that there were people who claimed that they were doing fundraising for Islamist groups in Libya through his mosque. That report came back in 2011. The imam of his mosque denied that, but he did also say that when he preached against ISIS, he saw something he called the face of hate in this young man. We have reports from neighbors and others. I mean, it sounds like there was enough there to concern people had they reported it elsewhere. It may have been enough of a flag or a helpful clue to authorities.
No, absolutely, and there's some reports as well that he traveled to Libya recently, so he may have been coordinating directly with terrorists over there, if that is in fact true. But this is also why what Donald Trump said in Saudi Arabia was so important. He pointed out that 95% of the victims of Islamic radicalism are Muslims, that the #1 victims of this terrorism are fellow Muslims. They're slaughtering them at a much higher rate than they're carrying out attacks here in the United States and in Europe as well. We need to rally the people of the Muslim world, including Muslims living within our countries, to help us fight Islamic radicalism. They have as much of an interest, if not more, than us in terms of stopping this stopping the terrorists. But the only way you can do that is by sending a message that we're on the same side. And so it was a really important pivot he made in Saudi Arabia, because his domestic politics has been very critical of Muslim community. He made a pivot in that meeting with Muslim leaders to say the vast majority of Muslims are allies in the fight against Islamic radicalism. They're the victims of Islamic radicalism, and we need to help them, and we need to bring them into our cause.
Thank you, Marc. With us there, Marc Thiessen.
My pleasure.
Stand by as we see the arrival ceremony. Sometimes there are cameras in here, and sometimes they are